attorney and myself to talk about our caucus's Voter Protection Act. So the last two presidential elections have played out like a tale of two Ohio's. In 2008, we were the gold standard in the nation for fair elections. We had the largest number of voters, the greatest voter turnout in Ohio's history. We encouraged Ohioans through early in-person and absentee voting. We opened voting locations on the weekend before Election Day. We did our job and we supported voters, and most importantly, we counted their votes. Those were the best of election times. In 2012, we reverted back to the worst of election times in Ohio, to 2004, when we were criticized for long lines, discouraged and disenfranchised voters. Now, it's not enough time to go into all of what happened in 2012, but last year's elections were plagued by lots of confusion. Ohio in 2012, like 2004, was once again the epicenter of elections controversy. Our chief elections officer was careless with taxes, spending your tax dollars to hire lawyers to pursue frivolous lawsuits while trying to shut down chances to vote and reduce voter turnout. Today, we are introducing the Voter Protection Act. This legislation is about Ohio's future. We have to start with the fundamental principle of what we as lawmakers and policymakers and other elected officials and boards of elections are here to do. We work for the voters. The Voter Protection Act makes the voter number one. The Voter Protection Act modernizes voter registration. The Voter Protection Act protects early voting opportunities, and the Voter Protection Act will advance absentee voting. The Voter Protection Act will clarify provisional voting to prevent voters from being disenfranchised by anybody's mistake, whether it's their mistake or the poll workers' mistake. We work for the voters, and it's not the other way around. The Voter Protection Act will update Ohio's election laws. So just to get a little bit more into the plan in terms of how we want to promote voter registration. You know, Ohio has come under scrutiny and litigation, Judicial Watch Inc. versus Husted, regarding the accuracy of voter rolls. Progress has been made in these areas, but increased involvement by all governmental agencies will both increase the number of Ohioans registered to vote and increase the accuracy of our voter rolls. Accurate voter rolls ease the burden on elections officials, reduce the number of provisional ballots cast, and reduce opportunities for fraud. 12 states allow citizens to register to vote online, and a few of those states, California, Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, etc. And according to the Arizona Secretary of State, over 70% of all registrations are now performed online, so that is really a good use of technology. And this state also saw a 9.5% increase in voter registrations and programs in the first 2 years. Connecticut, Delaware, and Hawaii have passed legislation allowing online registrations, but the services have not been brought online as of yet. When we get to provisional voting, it's important that we clarify the responsibility of poll workers and voters to make sure voters aren't disenfranchised because of a poll worker's error. And we know that all poll workers, they come to work, they want to do a good job. Many of them have been doing it for years. They're exercising their civic duty, which is a good thing, but we want to make sure that we increase opportunities to make sure that voters' votes count. This evidence will come from a form that is based on Judge Marbley's ruling in the SEIU and Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless case, as many of you may remember. We want to make sure that we stop the presumption that provisional ballots cast by eligible voters are somehow less valid or less important than other ballots. And it seems that in the state of Ohio right now, either deliberately or not, when one casts a provisional ballot, they are in many cases seen as a second-class voter, and that should not be the case. Right now, BOPs vote to count a ballot they presume is not valid, and the Voter Protection Act will require the boards of elections to vote to reject a ballot, working from an assumption that the ballot cast by the voter is already valid, and they would have to come together to try to say that it's not. And we know that the staff evaluates the provisional ballots. They put them in categories for the the BOEs, and then they discuss why or why not a particular ballot is valid. But we want to put the onus on the BOE to reject that ballot. In 2012, though 83.5% of provisional ballots were counted, there were about 34,000 such ballots that were rejected, and many of them did not need to be. Almost 10,000 were rejected for having voted in the wrong precinct, and almost 3,000 were rejected because the printed name or the signature was missing, or simply the signature was on the wrong place on the form. We know that current law requires the boards of elections to throw out ballots of voters who show up at the wrong place. We want to change that. If the voter comes to vote, they vote provisionally, and after all the requisite research is done by the boards of elections and it is determined that that person is eligible to vote in the state of Ohio, we should count their ballot. People don't wake up and go to vote only to have their vote not counted. They want their vote to count, and we should do everything in our power to make sure that their votes count. When it comes to absentee ballots, mail ballot applications to all registered voters in the general election in even number years. And in those general elections, the state of Ohio should be responsible for mailing out those ballots. As you all know, in the 2012 elections, the absentee ballot application was mailed out, but again, that was mailed out because Cuyahoga County stood up and fought very hard to make sure that it was mailed out, and that came under agreement that it was. But there's nothing in statute right now that says that we will continue as a state to promote that and to mail out those absentee ballot applications. Now, this last election demonstrated that everyone loves absentee voting, not just Democrats. Republicans and independents too. Ohio voters, period, like the opportunity. We want to establish an online system for requesting an absentee ballot. Right now, we know that 2 states have such systems. Maine comes easy to mind for me right now. And that would allow all citizens to request an absentee ballot online through their county boards of elections. We want to do some things to prevent long lines. The lines that were endured in 2012 were absolutely unacceptable. The larger the county, the longer the lines in most cases. Some people waiting up, anywhere between 2 to 4 hours to vote. That should make all of us ashamed. And it shouldn't matter what our political affiliation is. In the United States of America, in the state of Ohio, it is totally it's unacceptable to have people waiting in those long lines. People should not have to wait all day to vote, and that happened in 2012. So we don't want that to happen again. So we don't know all of the reasons for long lines, but in addition to protecting early voting opportunities, increased staffing and ballot access points can help both voters and poll workers avoid increased wait times. Capping the size of precincts and providing guidance for multiple precinct locations will help Ohio move forward on long line prevention. From our analysis, very few, if any, counties would have to increase the number of precincts. They may have to rework the map a bit, but it should not place a great deal of burden on the boards of elections. When it comes to modernization, we want to create what is called a voting modernization task force. And this task force will be a bipartisan task force, members from the House and the Senate, 2 members from the two members from the professional board of election, 2 members from the elections professionals groups, and we know by the way they're set up, it would be designated that it's the vice president and president, and the way they are established, one has to be a Democrat, the other one has to be a Republican, and then that board, those 6 members will then vote on 2 other people who will be experts in the field, and they will determine that as a group so that we will have that. And then also the Secretary of State and their designee would be a non-voting member on that modernization task force. Now this is important because it will promote a long-term bipartisan review of election standards. It will bring together legislators, administrators, and experts to make recommendations for improvement of Ohio's elections process, and it would formulate a review of ideas outside of how we traditionally handle these issues. We traditionally handle them either through legislation or we handle them when we're in a court battle. It would be nice to bring people together when none of that is happening, and on an ongoing basis they can look at these issues. Protect early voting opportunities. Now, uniformity has been bandied about like it is the Holy Grail. Uniformity doesn't equate to fair access for all Ohio voters. Uniformity aims for the lowest common denominator. The Voter Protection Act sets default hours and requires bipartisan support to change those hours. There should be at least a minimum standard across the state of Ohio, across boards of elections, but boards of elections also should have the flexibility that they need to tailor the voting times for their particular voters. That was taken away from boards of elections in 2012. So the minimums that would be set up in statute, so that at least wherever you are in the state, you can be guaranteed that you have weekend voting, that you have extended weekday hours, and that only the boards of elections members could come together to try to alter that. But voters deserve to have multiple opportunities to vote.